Subcommittee on Government Operations will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. I thank the witness for coming in today. Actually, the taxpayer advocate is an independent voice, which is well needed, certainly in our society, that defends the American taxpayer. And it's a privilege, Ms. Olson, to have you here and testify today. The complexity of the tax code and the need for the IRS to restore trust underscores that the taxpayers need to have someone fighting on their behalves, and which is why taxpayer advocates do that so well and do it on a daily basis. As members of Congress, we have an obligation to work with the American people and for the American people, and are committed to working with you in your efforts to ensure that the IRS improves taxpayer service delivery. Taxpayer Advocate's 2014 report to Congress highlights unacceptably low levels of service that the IRS is delivering to the taxpayers, with the IRS estimating that it will only answer half of the incoming calls, and those answered may wait over 30 minutes for service. And to give just a short personal story, in fact, when a member of my staff was receiving help for her personal tax return through the electronic federal tax payment system, and it was asked how long she would have to wait to speak with someone at the IRS who could help her over the phone, she was told, quote, "Well, it's really more of an exception that you will get to talk to someone," end quote. I find that extremely troubling in light of the fact that most people, at least people in our generation, believe that you need to talk and you have to have that dialogue to fully understand it. Hopefully there will be a day when a computer can answer things as compassionately and as completely as we would like to see. That's why I think it's critical that the IRS takes to heart the recommendations that you have offered, and the ranking member and I believe that we've got to work in a bipartisan way to not only support those that work for the IRS, but to restore the integrity of many of our federal workers, not just with the IRS. And so we know that that will have a component of financial obligations, which may be painful to my ears, but we've all talked about that going forward. I would like to say, though, that some of these issues, and what I look forward to hearing from you today, are those issues that may not have a direct correlation with the budget. We know that we've got to address that, and as we look at that, and certainly there will be questions on both sides of the aisle as that happens, but I want you to look at those areas that maybe have been systemic in their nature and long, that have not been a result of just fiscal budgetary constraints. And so as we restore the faith in the IRS with the American taxpayer, I believe that part of that is with a more simplified tax code, one that I would think that it wouldn't be difficult for me or anyone else to be able to figure out how to complete their tax return. Now it almost ensures. Today on tax day, I was on the phone with my son, who was saying, well, what do I put in this column and what do I put in that column? And I said, well, you should have done it a few days before today. But, you know, he was asking me all these different questions. And what I found was, and being a guy who had been in business for many, many years, that I couldn't answer the simple questions of someone who is just now getting to the point of paying real taxes. And he said, man, I can't believe they take this much. And so, Ms. Olson, thank you so much for your tireless work advocating on behalf of so many people who feel like that they are fighting against a machine that doesn't care. And I say that because there are that is the general view, but I will say that whether it is with your group or with the IRS in particular, I've found that there are a lot of people who truly want to serve this country and do so each and every day. And I think it's important that we address the issues so that the broader spectrum of those who faithfully carry out their duties each and every day do not get painted with that broad brush. And so with that, I would recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for holding this hearing. And welcome to Nina Olson, who served as the National Taxpayer Advocate since, I think, 2001. And very much, I know all of us appreciate your service, Ms. Olson, and your appearance today. The 2014 report identifies declining levels of taxpayer service, the chairman just referenced, as the #1 most serious problem, causing serious compliance issues and inflicting undue hardship and stress on our fellow American taxpayers. The challenges facing the IRS are real and many, including an increasing number of filed tax returns, escalating threats of identity theft, refund fraud, and data breaches, and an enormous gap in the amount of taxes owed versus those that are actually paid. That gap could do a lot for helping reduce the national debt. But despite these increasing and evolving challenges, according to Ms. Olson's report, there is a, quote, widening imbalance between the IRS's increasing workload and its diminishing resources. One can't ignore the reality that many of these serious problems are the result of the fact that we here in Congress created our nation's incredibly complex tax code, but in recent years we've stubbornly refused to appropriate the funds to administer it. The annual report notes that over the past 5 fiscal years, the IRS's inflation-adjusted budget was cut by 17%. These budget cuts have forced the IRS to shed at least 12,000 employees. That's 12,000 employees. And further significant workforce reductions expected this fiscal year. In this fiscal year alone, the IRS budget was slashed by $346 million, costing at least $2 billion in lost revenue, according to IRS estimates. The irony here is that in deliberately lowering the funding level for the IRS, to make the agency, in the words of the Financial Services Appropriations Subcommittee Chair, think twice about what you're doing and why. And, quote, focus on your core mission of providing taxpayer services, such as processing returns and refunds, providing customer service like answering the phone, and catching tax cheats. Unfortunately, with these budget cuts, we've achieved exactly the opposite result. And it almost looks by design to guarantee the opposite result. The report highlights the consequences of these ill-advised cuts, noting, and I quote, 35.6% of phone calls went unanswered by customer service representatives. 50% of pieces of correspondence not handled in a timely fashion. 0 tax returns virtually were prepared by IRS walk-in sites, and localized outreach and education have all but disappeared. Ms. Olson, in her report, eloquently captured the bottom line in the 2014 report, noting, quote, it's a challenge for any tax agency to properly administer a system such as the one we have, but it's impossible for an underfunded tax agency to do so. The victims of this underfunding are not just the IRS and its employees, but maybe more importantly, the victims are U.S. taxpayers themselves. I couldn't agree more with that assessment. Gutting the IRS's budget is, to me, penny wise and pound foolish. We don't have to love the IRS to understand that it's the revenue collection agency of the United States government, and that we could actually, by making it more efficient, we could spread the idea of tax fairness and equality. It doesn't preclude making the tax system, as the chairman said, fairer and easier and more efficient, but starving the IRS of resources has created lots of problems for our fellow citizens, and I certainly look forward to hearing Ms. Olson's testimony to further elucidate that issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the ranking member, and I'll hold open the record for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. We will now recognize our witness. I'm pleased to welcome Ms. Nina Olson, the National Taxpayer Advocate at the Internal Revenue Service. Welcome, Ms. Olson. Pursuant to committee rules, witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so if you would please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Let the record reflect that the witness is answered in the affirmative, and thank you. And you are now recognized for your opening testimony, and we'll be more lenient with our 5-minute rule so that we can hear completely from you.
Thank you. Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me today to discuss the National Taxpayer Advocate's 2014 Annual Report to Congress. As you know, I am required by statute to report each year on at least 20 of the most serious problems facing taxpayers and to make administrative and legislative recommendations to mitigate, if not eliminate, those problems. In addition to my reporting function, the Taxpayer Advocate Service, through its local taxpayer advocate offices, handles on average about 250,000 cases each year in which taxpayers have a problem or a dispute with the IRS and are experiencing significant hardship. The underpinning of my 2014 report is the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or TBOR, which the IRS adopted at my recommendation in June 2014. Because taxpayer rights, their existence, and their protections are essential to establishing and maintaining taxpayer trust in the tax system, I recommended that Congress codify the TBOR. I am delighted that the House is voting today on this important piece of legislation and that companion legislation will be introduced in the Senate probably today. The next step is to ensure that these rights have enforceable remedies. In my report, my first legislative proposal is a brief description of all of my office's recommendations for taxpayer protections, including some new ones, organized under one or more of the 10 rights in the TBOR. It is my concern about the right to quality service that drove me to identify as the #1 and #2 most serious problems the IRS's current failure to meet taxpayer service needs and the IRS's lack of a method to determine what those needs are from a taxpayer's perspective. From January 1st through April 13th of this year, the IRS answered only 37% of the calls it received from taxpayers who were gated to a customer service representative. And those taxpayers who managed to get through sat on hold an average of about 24 minutes. By comparison, 71% of taxpayers got through and waited on hold an average of about 14 minutes during the same period just last year. The IRS is only answering the most basic of tax law questions through April 15th and none after that date. Let me repeat. If you call tomorrow, April 16th, you will not get answers to any tax law questions from the IRS. The IRS is no longer preparing tax returns for the most vulnerable populations, namely the elderly, the disabled, and the low income. And as of April 4th, over 44% of individual correspondence, that is letters from taxpayers, is over age compared to 28% last year. I have never seen such low levels of taxpayer service during my 40-year career in the field of tax, and they are officially the worst since at least 2001, when the IRS implemented its current performance measures. Taxpayers call and write the IRS not only to get answers to tax law questions, refund status, or transcripts, but also to request penalty abatements, respond to math error assessment notices, and arrange to make payments. If taxpayers can't get through to the IRS for any of these transactions, the IRS will proceed to collect taxes and penalties that the taxpayer actually may not owe or cannot afford to pay and still meet basic living expenses. This causes real harm to real taxpayers. This performance decline is huge and results largely from a combination of more work and reduced resources. On the workload side, the IRS is receiving 11% more returns from individuals, 18% more returns from business entities, and 70% more telephone calls through fiscal year 2013 than 10 years ago, not to mention implementation of the Affordable Care Act and the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. On the funding side, the IRS's budget has been reduced by about 17% in inflation-adjusted terms since fiscal year 2010. As a consequence, the IRS has already reduced its workforce by nearly 12,000 employees, and it projects it will have to reduce its workforce by several thousand additional employees during fiscal year 2015. Even considering advances in technology, these cuts go too far, too fast. I don't see any substitute for sufficient personnel if high-quality taxpayer service is to be provided. Having said that, I also believe it's incumbent on the IRS to spend the resources it has as effectively and efficiently as possible. Reductions in service always should be made with the goal of minimizing the impact on taxpayers and performance. I find it difficult to ascertain exactly how the IRS made its resource allocation decisions with respect to taxpayer service or what data it relied upon in regard to taxpayer impact and need. Similarly, it is my experience and the findings of several research studies conducted by my office that the IRS regularly creates work for itself, especially in the context of its enforcement programs. In my testimony and my report, I have provided numerous examples of programs in which I believe the IRS can utilize its resources more effectively and efficiently. To illustrate with just one example, I have testified before this subcommittee twice before on the subject of tax-related identity theft. For years, I have pointed out the waste of government resources and taxpayer time and the angst caused by the IRS's failure to assign a single employee to identity theft cases involving multiple years or multiple IRS functions. But because the IRS does not evaluate its performance from the taxpayer's perspective, that is, having to navigate one's way around multiple divisions even as you experience the trauma of having your identity stolen, the IRS has refused to conduct a pilot of our proposal, much less implement it. In my 2014 report, I have produced the hard evidence of just how much time and effort on the IRS's and the taxpayers' part the current IRS identity theft procedures cost. Our studies showed that over 2/3 of IRS identity theft cases were moved around within or between IRS functions, with each reassignment delaying resolution and frustrating the taxpayer. When cycle time was measured from the perspective of the taxpayer, it was 2 months longer than what the IRS officially pronounces it to be. And we found that the IRS closed 22% of the cases prematurely, that is, not providing to the taxpayers the relief they so badly needed. All of this burden and delay is avoidable. The IRS just needs to spend a few minutes at the first contact identifying those cases involving multiple years and issues and assigning those folks to a single employee who serves as their sole contact throughout the duration of the case and ensures that all issues are addressed. That would provide victims with the effective assistance they deserve. I am sometimes asked why the IRS does not adopt more of my office's recommendations, which to many people seem so reasonable. It's worth noting that the IRS actually accepts somewhere around half of the recommendations we make in each report. But even when there is agreement in principle, the recommendations may not be implemented because of funding or programming priorities, or because a conceptual agreement is undermined by disagreement over the details. First and foremost, the IRS defines itself as an enforcement agency. As a result, it sometimes seems to overlook the fact that the real driver of our self-assessment system is taxpayers' willingness to voluntarily come forward and report and pay the tax they owe, so high-quality taxpayer service is critical. Yet the IRS knows very little about why taxpayers comply with the tax law, and it knows even less about how its enforcement and service initiatives actually impact taxpayers' willingness to comply. The world changes, and unless management continually tests and evaluates its assumptions about the effectiveness of its programs, it will continue to run them the same way, causing it to miss opportunities to improve efficiency and productivity and to win taxpayer trust. I don't want to paint a very dark picture of the IRS. The IRS actually functions very well for the significant majority of taxpayers, and IRS employees, including Taxpayer Advocate Service employees, are incredibly dedicated and hardworking. In addition, the IRS is embarking on a comprehensive review of its service and compliance approaches to map out a vision of how tax administration should operate 5 years from now. This effort provides Congress with an opportunity to ensure the IRS is on track for treating taxpayers fairly and reasonably. So in my view, to sum up, the best way for Congress to hold the IRS accountable for how it allocates resources and makes decisions is through active, consistent oversight of the agency, not just on the issue of the day, but on the routine work the IRS does. It is critical that the IRS takes steps to rebuild congressional and taxpayer trust. It is also critical that Congress provide the oversight and funding that the IRS needs to do its important work of helping taxpayers meet their tax obligations, collecting the revenue on which the rest of the government depends. This hearing is a significant step in that direction of consistent oversight, and I thank you for inviting me here today to be part of this important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Olson, for your important work, and your entire written statement will be made part of the record. And the chair recognizes the vice chair of the Government Operations Subcommittee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
I thank the chairman and thank you for holding this hearing, and Ms. Olson, thank you for the work you do, and thank you for still having a smile on your face as you do it. Today is, I guess we would say, Happy Tax Day. Relative to the complexity of the IRS tax code, and the fact that as a result of the last count, 18 different tax increases put into the code now through the Affordable Care Act, at a cost of over $770 billion over the course of the next 10 years. I wanted to ask this starting question, Ms. Olson, why did your office identify healthcare implementation as a, and I quote, most serious problem in your most recent report?
Well, whenever you have a program of such size as the Affordable Care Act, there are opportunities for things to go wrong. And so we have tried to identify in advance, based on just past experience, what could possibly go wrong in this filing season and what burden it puts on taxpayers. Also, this program, the Affordable Care Act, is particularly challenging because the IRS, who has actually acquitted itself very well during this filing season on its obligations under ACA, is on the receiving end of lots of other federal agencies. And that's often where the problems are arising. For example, getting incorrect information from the exchanges that we're supposed to be matching up against taxpayers' returns. We didn't create that information. We're just on the receiving end of it.
Is that part of the problem for the 800,000 people who got wrong information?
That's correct.
Probably going to pay for?
Well, I think that the idea is that they're supposed to wait if they filed early and with the incorrect information. No one will collect that, so all the taxpayers of the United States will pay for that. Others who got incorrect information but may be owed more money should file amended returns if they have already filed before they got their corrected information. And that, I would note, creates more work for the IRS because we not only have to process the original return, but the amended return.
Right. What additional problems may result for the taxpayer from this law?
So we are seeing some issues where taxpayers aren't aware that they are eligible for an exemption of the individual shared responsibility payment, and so they may be either paying the penalty or we may be sending them a bill when in fact they may not have to pay it. We're seeing instances where we're getting returns in where we think taxpayers do have a premium tax credit, but they haven't submitted a reconciliation, so we have to go back out and ask them to do that. So all of these touches take time, and bring in phone calls. And I think we really won't see the impact of this until after the filing season, when we start sorting through all this stuff.
Which is my next question. Will your office or the IRS, or both, collect data related to this tax season on the number of individuals who will have their tax refund changed as a result of the health care law?
Yes, and in my June report to Congress, we will do a summary based on the information we have as of June 30th on this filing season and the outcome of the filing season with respect to the Affordable Care Act.
Do you have any estimates now? Or guesstimates?
I really don't. I do know, and this is an interesting thing, that as of this week, the IRS was still looking for 1.5 million returns from taxpayers who should be getting the premium tax credit. I think a lot of taxpayers held off to the last week of the filing season because they were concerned whether they would owe or not. And that's a lot. That's why we just don't know what the impact of the Affordable Care Act is. We are anticipating 4 million total, and we haven't gotten in 1.5 million, and that's the last week of the filing season. So anything could happen.
Wow.
Yeah.
After this filing season, will you be able to review or collect the actual numbers of Americans who saw their tax bill grow or shrink as a result of the health care law?
Yes, at least with respect to the Affordable Care Act or the individual shared responsibility payment.
Will you also be able to collect information on the number of Americans who filed for an exemption?
I think so. Some of the exemption data comes from the exchanges, but we would at least know some taxpayers have said we have a pending exemption at the exchanges, so we'd at least have that kind of information.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair will recognize Ms. Conley, excuse me. That's how rumors start there, ranking member. Ms. Maloney from New York, because the ranking member has deferred to you.
All of our Irish names apparently something else.
I want to thank the ranking member for deferring to me. I have a conflict with another committee I'm supposed to be participating in, but I very much wanted to hear Mrs. Olson's testimony and to tell you that the Americans living abroad, the legitimate taxpayers living abroad, have told me numerous times how cooperative you've been, and I have a series of questions they've asked me to ask you. I hope I have a chance to get them answered, otherwise I'll put them in the record. But I was very interested in your attention to identity theft, and I think every member on this panel can attest to the fact that we're getting calls every day in our district offices about that. And I just would like to follow up on those points that you raised in your testimony and in your written report. In light of the limited operating budget at the IRS, are you satisfied with the agency's ability to evolve its fraud detection filters to keep up with these new schemes that are coming out every day?
I think that this is a challenge for any kind of agency, and I think the IRS is actually doing a very good job. And I think that recently they held a security summit with some of the private entities to identify ways to learn from them what schemes they may be seeing and sharing information so we can maybe get even further ahead of this. But I do have to say, people who are perpetrating these schemes are very, very creative, and we're always going to be in the instance of letting some returns go through and then picking it up on the back end when somebody's come in and said, wait, you've harmed me instead of the thief.
And would additional funds improve your ability at the IRS for fraud detection filters?
I think that it would allow us to maybe bring in some folks, if we had also critical pay authority, to bring in really talented people to work on this, yes.
And also the IRS has reported that it was able to prevent, this is tremendously important, to prevent the payment of approximately $24.2 billion in tax refunds. And would you expect the amount of fraudulent refunds the IRS could prevent? Do you think they would be higher if you were funded to the point that you feel is proper?
I think we would be able to prevent more. I think that the amount of refunds we'll prevent will continue to increase anyway because word is out, hit the IRS.
Okay. Well, I just also want to ask you about taxpayers abroad. We're in a world economy now, and we have many Americans with business interests overseas, and there's and they owe taxes to the United States, and there's widespread fear and uncertainty for potential assessment of onerous tax evasion penalties when a taxpayer makes a filing error, and the general complication of filing from overseas to the extreme number of reforms that are required. And I fully support your efforts to find tax avoiders and prevent tax havens overseas, but I have a concern, and I support the legitimate American citizens that are residing abroad, and they often find themselves without regular banking services. Now, this is a huge problem, and my office has seen notices from individual account holders from foreign banks that effectively state that Americans need not apply because of our owners' banking requirements, and these U.S. citizens have had their foreign and domestic accounts closed or have been refused accounts, and I really want to commend that you have really been responding to this, but this is a tremendous problem if Americans, because their companies are abroad or whatever reason, they're studying abroad or they have a business abroad or whatever, that they can't even have a bank account because of the onerous requirements that the banks put on them that are put on by our system. So I want to commend your recent recommendations with regard to bona fide, honest Americans living abroad with their taxes, such as eliminating duplicative reporting requirements and developing a definition of financial accounts based on where the American citizen is a bona fide resident. What is the next step in consideration for these recommendations that you have put out?
Well, first, I think that the laws actually allow the IRS to interpret them much more reasonably toward American citizens and other U.S. taxpayers living abroad. You don't need additional legislation in most instances, and that's why we've made administrative recommendations to the IRS. And the next step is for Congress to basically hold the IRS and the Treasury Department accountable for making these changes.
But the problem that we have is that the foreign banks, or the banks overseas, are refusing to service American bank accounts. And this is a huge problem.
I think if you really carved out that exception for bona fide residents, that you would eliminate some of the fears from the foreign banks about these reporting requirements. The FATCA regime is new, and it remains to be seen whether it's effective, and I think some entities are running scared because it just sounds so onerous. They may join up in 5 years, but 5 years going in without an account is crazy for someone abroad. And there are at least 7 million U.S. citizens living abroad, not to mention the U.S. taxpayers. If I might also add, at the same time that we're imposing all these requirements on foreign U.S. taxpayers abroad, the IRS announced that it was closing the remaining 4 tax attaché offices that we have in U.S. embassies abroad to save $4 million. And that's just, as to use the same phrase, it's penny wise and pound foolish as we're imposing more and more responsibilities and burdens on these taxpayers.
Well, my time has expired, and I just feel this is a huge problem that we should have a bipartisan approach to, because many Americans, we're in a global economy, Americans live overseas, and they're entitled to bank accounts. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the chairman. Ms. Olson, you've been the taxpayer advocate for 14 years?
Yes, I have.
God bless you. How many people work for you?
I have about 1,800, 1,900 employees.
1,900 employees all around the country, right?
Yes, 74 offices.
When did your main office or any of your offices first learn that the Internal Revenue Service was targeting conservative groups around the country?
I think it was about February. My office in the headquarters learned in February of 2013. We got between 2011 and early 2013 about 19 cases, and they showed up in different offices.
So you learned before Ms. Lerner went public on May 10th, 2013 at the Bar Association with the plan in question and gave the false narrative that she gave. You learned before that date, 2 months before that date.
We had one case elevated to us in my headquarter office.
And how'd that get elevated to you?
Through my employees who had 2 or 3 cases in their office, and they saw a pattern, and we went over to Ms. Lerner and Holly Paz, Ms. Paz, and we talked to them about this case, and we got that case moving.
And so you met with Ms. Lerner and Ms. Paz in February of 2013?
I personally did not, but my
Your
staff
people did.
did.
And tell me about that discussion.
They talked about what was going on in that case, and we said, what are your concerns and what information do we need to get? And they said, we are putting out guidance, and we will start processing these cases. And at that point, they put out guidance.
Did they tell you at that time that the terms Tea Party and Patriot were the identifying terms used to select these groups, pull them out, give them the enhanced scrutiny, and deny them their First Amendment rights to get their tax-exempt status and
No, they
exercise
did
their free
not.
speech? They didn't tell us that.
No, they did not say that to my
But you
staff.
learned official targeting was taking place when the rest of the world learned on May 10th, 2013?
Yes,
when
I
this learned.
did.
Okay. Now, so you said you had a few cases come to you. We had dozens of people, Tea Party groups come to us clear back in 11 and 12. We actually met with Ms. Lerner, our personal staff and oversight staff met with Ms. Lerner in 2012, and she lied to us and said there was no targeting going on. So we asked for the investigation. So I got to believe the taxpayer advocate, as your stuff said, you are the voice of the taxpayer. Your job is to resolve problems with the IRS every year and address systematic issues within the IRS. I got to believe you had notice before February.
I did not. And I also have to say that
So no one of those 1,900 employees across the country, dozens and dozens of news accounts of groups saying, you know what, we're getting asked all kinds of intrusive questions. We're being delayed now a couple of years. No one in your 1,900 employee organization came to you and said, you know what, we might want to look into this. After all, we're supposed to be the voice of the taxpayer, and we have millions of people across the country who are being denied their First Amendment rights by the Internal Revenue Service. I never set off any alarm.
my employees worked each of those 19 cases, and most of them were from the congressional offices that folks had referred to us, and they worked them, and they got relief in some, and they didn't get relief in others, but they kept working them. And it wasn't until February 2013 that one office had 3 cases that looked like it was a pattern
Okay, so
and elevated
I want to
it
clarify
my
something, Ms.
office.
Olson, I appreciate that. So those 19 cases you referred to, you said there were 2 or 3 that you took to Ms. Lerner and Ms. Paz in February of 2013.
There's one.
Oh, one of them you took. So when did you get that first of those 19? Was that back in 2011,
It was
2010?
spread over, out of 1 million cases, it was spread over from
so
2011
the
to
Office of the Taxpayer
2013.
Advocate was on notice much earlier than 2 months before Ms. Lerner gave her false...
About 6 of my offices received cases between 2011 and 2013.
Okay.
Those 19 cases
got
were
it.
spread out.
Okay, I got 1 minute left, and I want to go to a article in Politico from just last month, well, 2 months ago, February 26th of this year, and it says, from the IRS, death by delay. At least a half dozen applicants are still waiting for an answer from the IRS. And the one that they cite the most in here is the Albuquerque Tea Party, which is still waiting, been waiting 5 years to get something that should take a lot less time than that. What are you doing about that situation and the other 5 entities who are in the same position?
I can't discuss individual taxpayer cases.
Okay, take it in the general sense. What are you doing about these entities who are still being denied their opportunity to exercise their most fundamental right, their First Amendment free speech rights in a political nature? What are you doing as the voice of the taxpayer to help these groups who some have been waiting as long as 5 years?
My staff is closely looking at the IRS's exempt organization procedures, both respect to 501c3s and 501c4s. And I can't really talk about the specific cases to say whether they are reasonably being looked at or that the IRS
I'm out of time.
is
If I could, Mr. Chairman, can you get us the date that you got the first notice from a Tea Party or conservative organization that they were being harassed, the very first time that your office was noticed that something might be going wrong here?
I think the first case arrived in the Taxpayer Advocate Service sometime in early 2011 or late 2010 in one office in the Taxpayer Advocate Service.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the ranking member of the Government Operations Subcommittee, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify your testimony, did your offices or your employees also get complaints about BOLAs involving progressive names?
I think there were 2 cases or so dealing with that.
And were they, I mean, in your opinion, were groups denied their First Amendment rights by the IRS in this process?
I think the IRS used certain terms to identify cases that raised questions, and I think that was incredibly inappropriate. And I am not a judge, so I will not render an opinion on whether it violated their First Amendment rights.
And are you aware of a number of organizations that, in fact, to this day have been denied their request for tax-exempt status?
I think that we may have had one case where they were denied, but that was after 2013.
One.
I think that's correct.
One.
I can certainly verify it.
So the narrative that a whole bunch of people are out there being persecuted by the hobnail Buddha government would seem to be a bit of an exaggeration.
I think most of them during that time were just held up and no decisions were made.
Is it not also true that with respect to 501c4s, many of these organizations, if they chose, could self-declare?
Yes, they do not need the IRS letter to be treated as a tax-exempt organization.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I also would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement of Colleen Kelly, the National President of the National Treasury Employees Union, responding to the testimony today, and a letter addressed to both you and me from the Professional Managers Association, just for inclusion in the record.
Without objection.
I thank the chair. I want to go back now to the whole issue of the funding of IRS. To what extent do you think a lot of the problems we're talking about, closing overseas office representatives, customer service, let alone audit capability and the like, has to do with, frankly, the starvation of, I mean, it's one thing to say, let's get efficient and let's cut back, but $1.2 billion in cuts, 12,000 employees fewer in roughly a 4-year period, that sounds pretty serious to me. And when I go a little further in terms of what that actually represents, half the workforce is over 50. 40% are eligible to retire within 4 years. The number of employees under 30 has actually been declining, meaning suggesting a less desirable workplace, and is now less than 3% of the IRS workforce, translating into 1,900 employees under the age of 30 out of, I think, 91,000 employees, something like that. Is that roughly right? So what's your, as the advocate on behalf of the rest of us, what does this mean from your point of view, Ms. Olson?
Well, I think there's no answer to the taxpayer service side of the equation except more funding, even as we move more into electronic, taxpayer counts and things like that. When the IRS is proposing to do things to you, you really want to talk to somebody to make sure they got your information and understand what you're saying. On the enforcement side, I really do believe that they can do a lot better with their procedures. And there, what I really worry about is that they're just not bringing the innovation in, and they're not bringing the young folks that can look at it and say, well, let's think about it as a different way. Let's take a different approach. So I think that there are opportunities on both sides. And then I will also say that I can't emphasize enough that it's not just about the funding, because we could maybe absorb fewer employees as we get more electronic, but it is the amount of work that the IRS is getting. There is so much more work that we're doing.
But let me stop you right there, because I asked Mr. Koskinen this question. The funding affects the IT investment.
Yes.
So, for example, at IRS, correct me if I'm wrong, the average replacement age is 7 years or above for a computer, whereas the standard in the private sector is between 2 and 4 years. Is that correct?
I can only attest to my own the age of my own computer and my own BlackBerry, and yes, it's pretty darn old.
Yep. And what can go wrong with that?
A lot.
Right.
Like this morning, I was bumped off the major IT system.
So, and we were also told that in terms of archiving material, records, taxpayer records and the like, the general guidance at IRS is print and save. Is that correct? Well, when you're talking about the volume, we're talking about number of taxpayers, number of employees and so forth. Print and save is just a pretty primitive way of trying to do business in this part of the 21st century. Would you not agree, Ms.
I would
Wilson?
agree with that.
So when we look at reinvesting in IRS, it's technology, it's targeted personnel, and its capability, so that we're returning a level of customer service for American taxpayers that we would all agree is acceptable as opposed to where we are right now. Would that be
That's
fairly-
correct. And I would also suggest, setting some goals for the IRS and holding them accountable for it and saying, how are you going to achieve this if we give you this money?
I'm all for doing that, yep. Mr. Chairman, I think that's very good advice, setting goals before we tying it to whatever additional resources we provide. Thank you very much.
I'm shocked. So we will go to the gentleman from Georgia. Mr. Carter is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Sullivan, thank you for being here. We appreciate this very much. Let me ask you, earlier this year, we heard testimony that there were over 800,000 incorrect forms sent to taxpayers. Has that been corrected?
I've been told that they're either all been corrected or they're in the process of being corrected. It's not us correcting them, so I don't know for sure.
Who was it corrected?
It's CMS that is doing the correction.
And who's responsible for getting them to the taxpayers?
It would be CMS getting them to the taxpayers, and the IRS would get a copy as well.
Okay, you don't know, so you're assuming that it has been taken care of?
I've been told that it's either completely taken care of, there may be a few stragglers, and they are in the process of being corrected.
Are these people who were impacted by this given any kind of extension or anything?
They were not given an extension. They were told to hold off filing if they hadn't filed already. And if they hadn't had filed and they got a corrected one and they owed tax, they would not have to refile. If they didn't owe tax and they were due a refund, they should file an amended return. They were also given penalty relief, so if they owed tax and they couldn't afford to pay, they wouldn't be penalized for not paying the tax on time or not paying estimated taxes.
Is this going to have any kind of impact to delay their refunds?
Yes, I'm sure it will, and we're also seeing not just with the 800,000, but we have a bunch of returns that are coming in where we don't have information from many of the state exchanges, and so we have to delay the returns for a few days in order to be able to get information and match them. We've also just sent out about 90,000 letters to taxpayers where we're expecting to have a premium tax credit reconciliation, and there isn't any on their returns, and so their refunds are being held up too, and that will require some work to go through.
Just out of curiosity, has this been more of a problem with the Affordable Care Act than you thought it would be?
Actually, I have to say, I was very negative about, in my estimations. I thought it would be a huge problem, and it's actually not been as much of a problem as I thought it was.
Of course, you're one of those 800,000.
Yeah.
So it's a luck of the draw.
Oh, I'm saying, for those people who are caught up in it, it's very unpleasant and very disturbing.
For those people whose refunds may be delayed, are they going to draw interest or anything on that?
If it's after a certain period of time, I think it's May 15th, they draw interest. That's the law. Most of them come to us and ask for us to help with the processing of their returns if they have an economic hardship of some sort.
Okay, and if they owed and it was sent to them incorrectly and then they got the correct form in, they won't be penalized?
They won't
But
be
you don't-
penalized, and if they owe, they wouldn't have to refile.
Okay. In one of the issues that you stated was the most serious problem was number 8, IRS does not ensure penalties promote voluntary compliance as recommended by Congress and others. When was that recommendation by Congress made?
Many years ago, Congress actually, in the 1998 Act and elsewhere, said to IRS, we want you to look at how penalties are being used and whether they work. We pass these penalties, and they're supposed to drive voluntary compliance in the future. Come back and report to us whether we've got it right. Are they using them in a way that drives voluntary
Has
compliance?
that been done?
Never,
Never.
never.
Have we been given any explanation as to why it was not done?
No.
Who was in charge of it?
Well, it would be part of the IRS research function, and there's also a service-wide penalty office, and when we asked them, are you looking at it, they said they didn't have the resources. That was their official answer to us.
We didn't have are you serious?
I'm serious.
You're not kidding, that's just what
I'm
they
not
told you.
kidding, that was the answer.
So essentially, you just ignored Congress.
Yes, that's part of our point in the annual report to Congress. And that's partly what I'm saying about the oversight of the IRS, is that, having a hearing that says, well, what do penalties do, and how are you using them, and are you using them appropriately? Are you penalizing the wrong people? Are they making people angry? My office did a study that showed that taxpayers who were penalized and later got the penalty abated, taken away, actually became more non-compliant in the future than taxpayers who were never penalized at all.
Now, this very
Which is just the opposite of what we want.
Absolutely.
Which creates rework for us. We now have a whole bunch of taxpayers who are more non-compliant than they were beginning.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that, and I yield back the remaining time.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Olson, let me ask one question, because I have a burr in my saddle on this particular issue. Under sworn testimony before this subcommittee, it was a joint subcommittee hearing between this committee and Mr. Jordan's Healthcare Committee. We were told that there are 800,000 wrong forms were a printing error and would be corrected within a week or so. That was sworn testimony. Do you believe that it could be as simple as a printing error if we are still dealing with it or just getting it fixed on April 15th?
I really don't know what the cause of it is, and so I can't answer that. I apologize, but I don't know.
How long, let me ask it a different way then. How long does it take to reprint something if it is a printing error? Now, you can answer that.
Well, it should not take long if it's a printing error. Yes,
A week?
correct.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the clarification. And the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Good afternoon, Ms. Olson. I noted that in your 2014 report, you identified your most serious problem as the declining levels of taxpayer services, and that would appear to be a funding issue, if that's correct. Can you explain to me how that declining taxpayer services that you outlined in your report is affecting your ability to service the people that you're required to?
Well, as I've noted before, that people cannot get through the phones. The correspondence can't be answered, so you actually get into a cycle where the taxpayer's calling and they don't get through on the phone, so they write the IRS, and then they don't get an answer from the IRS, and so they call back. And the impact to the taxpayers is that taxpayers aren't just calling about where their refund is, but they're calling to say, you sent me a notice and you're going to assess tax against me and I don't owe this tax. They're calling to say, I know I owe some tax, but I want to enter into an installment agreement. Don't levy on my bank account.
Right.
And if they can't get through, then the IRS is just automated. That's where they have done automation, for levying on bank accounts, for
getting the money.
For getting the money, and for assessing additional tax. And so that stuff just goes on autopilot, and then bad things happen to taxpayers.
Well, I think that this is probably a very important area that Congress needs to consider, is the funding for the IRS generally, to be able, and for your division, so that you're able to assist individuals who are attempting to do the right thing, but may not understand or have the resources to do that.
Right.
So I represent a particularly interesting area, the Virgin Islands, which has a very unique relationship with the IRS. We use the Mirror Tax Code, and we have very stringent guidelines about what makes you a bona fide tax resident, what your sourcing rules are with regard to how people can take exemptions or whatever for their tax purposes. And I wanted to ask you if you feel that the IRS is adequately represented in the Virgin Islands to deal with the issues that are unique to the people there.
I am very concerned about the IRS's presence throughout the world on the civil side, and I think that the Virgin Islands, we could certainly have more of a footprint there. Just as I mentioned before with Mrs. Maloney, that, we needed more presence internationally on the civil side to provide taxpayers throughout the world who are U.S. taxpayers with assistance.
So one of the things that my constituents have noted is the criminal in the criminal investigations unit. potentially the lack of training that they may have in terms of understanding the mirror tax code. And we have people who are constantly calling the Taxpayer Advocacy Group.
No.
And do you know, or have you a record of what the size of your group or individuals? Do you have people specifically that are assigned to the territories?
My
or the
Puerto
places where
Rico office and my Hawaii offices, both of them handle international taxpayer concerns, and Puerto Rico is one of my largest offices, and so they get most of the Virgin Island cases. And we do a lot of training on them, and we're very much aware of the bona fide resident issue and the statute of limitations issue and the mirror code issues.
Right, and because of course, we're concerned that if you're in Puerto Rico, it means that the agents will focus more of their attention on Puerto Rico. And so that the Virgin Islands, which oftentimes is in competition with Puerto Rico for some of the individuals that are living there, that we may be getting short shrift, and that there may not even be due process that is completely adequate for all of the residents of those territories because of those specific issues. And, we're seeing a lot of litigation going on right now with the IRS because of that, which potentially could have been avoided if there had been a larger presence of the taxpayer advocates there.
Well, we were very involved in that issue that led to some of the litigation, and I think that my writings have been cited by the court, actually, in some of that litigation favorably, which I was pleased to see. We have actually put proposals out about expanding our taxpayer advocate offices into foreign countries. The reason why I have offices in every single state is because Congress put in the law that the taxpayer advocate has to have at least one office in each state. I can tell you today that if that wasn't in the law, I wouldn't have offices in every single state. There's no such language about territories, and there's no such language about being in some of the tax attachés that they're proposing to close abroad.
Okay.
So it's sort of hard for me to get that growth, and we have made a legislative recommendation and administrative recommendations to that effect of Congress actually legislating that we have some offices abroad or in the territories.
Well, I would love to work with your office to try and support that and to push
Great.
that forward. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I think there is general agreement that there would be a number of people wanting to support that particular effort.
And a lot of people competing for that
I
position.
think so. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Thanks much. In 2009, the IRS agreed to develop a plan to the way it administers penalties and offers a compromise. Could you comment on whether they've implemented such a plan or what's going on there?
This was for like payroll service providers or just generally offers and compromise?
I think general.
Yeah, well, we are constantly disappointed about how the IRS is underutilizing the authority Congress gave it to settle tax debts for reasonable collection potential or principles of equity or, economic hardship. And the IRS, after a debt is 3 years old, the IRS has 10 years in general to collect a tax debt. And after a debt gets to year 3, we collect essentially nothing on that debt. Old debts you just don't collect on. And so for the IRS to have all of these old debts and not use offer and compromise authority is just silly. We could get these taxpayers clean going forward. They have to promise to comply with the laws for the next 5 years. That's long enough to train a taxpayer to be a compliant taxpayer.
Are tax debts dischargeable in bankruptcy?
Some debts are and some debts are not.
A lot of these debts, what do you see causes somebody to be that far in debt? I mean, there's always a stereotype, you think of somebody, living the high life and not paying their taxes. But what do you think is the average person who owes $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 out?
Yeah, most of it is somebody that might be self-employed and just didn't account for the self-employment tax. That's always a surprise at the end of the year. And the thing that's really disappointing is that many of the debts, whether it's on the business side or the individual side, are very small at the beginning. And the IRS just, puts them in a queue, and they sit there for years and years, and the penalties and interest double, and interest accrues daily under the law. So it's, just a huge amount, and before long, the tax is actually dwarfed by the amount of penalty and interest. By the time the IRS picks up that case 6 years later, it's something that the taxpayer can't pay. And if they might have been able to enter into an installment agreement the first or second year and get rid of it over 2 or 3 years and be good going forward.
I mean, you could have a situation where you have a self-employed person, or maybe a small businessman, which is a self-employed person, who's just not making money.
Right.
Right? That's what's going on. I
Right.
mean, a lot of these debts, they're not bad people who are buying boats and vacations. They're just people who are working 60 hours a week losing money, right?
And some of these folks, they've gotten into trouble and they realize that they need to maybe not run the business. And going forward, they are a wage earner and they have this back debt. So here we've got a taxpayer who's compliant going forward. Let's use offer and compromise to deal with this debt and help them not be burdened by it. And I don't think the rest of the taxpayers of the world will object too much if they know that it's the amount that the person can really afford to pay. And that's the rules for offer and compromise, the reasonable collection potential, what we reasonably expect to be able to collect over the remaining 10 years.
So what would happen is we'd probably get in more money and somebody's life would no longer be ruined.
We have studies that show that. And we also have studies, so at one point in 2005, we studied the offer and compromise program and saw that the IRS, by rejecting offers, left money on the table. We tracked what happened with those cases, and not a dollar was collected, and we turned down money that was being offered to us.
Ms. Olson, it's been over 20 years since I was a lawyer, and I finally found someone who has compassion on the poor small businessman who business has failed. Well, good luck. I'm glad you brought it to our attention. Do you have any suggestions what we can do to move these people along in the IRS, prod them along so they aren't hounding these people onto death?
Submitting questions to them, holding a hearing about what they are doing on the collection side and why aren't they using the offer and compromise authority better. That's the kind of oversight I think would be very, very productive, because actually Congress has given it the tools to be able to resolve these issues and bring people into voluntary compliance going forward. And that's the name of the game, that they go to get into voluntary compliance, they go and sin no more.
IRS is less compassionate than Congress? Good grief, that's okay, thank you very much. I yield the rest of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Olson, I want to thank you for your testimony. I want to ask just a few, very few follow-up questions. I'll give you a few others that your staff can respond to. One of those, and you touched on it much earlier in your testimony, was really with regards to service levels and measuring service levels, how the IRS does it, how you see it from a consumer's point of view. How difficult would that be to start to look at it from the taxpayer's point of view in terms of, I often think that the best penalty for some of the highest senior levels within the IRS is to make them get on the phone and wait for a response. And as I do with some of our airline executives, because they get a special deal, and if they experience what the average person experienced, perhaps they would see it as a problem. So how do we best, in a bipartisan way, establish a standard for those service, what I call the cycle of service, as they would see it from a taxpayer's point of view?
I think the first thing the IRS needs to do is to really beef up its research on what taxpayer needs are. We have a very diverse population, and they have really not done the research in recent years to identify what taxpayers need and what types of taxpayers need what kind of services. We have proposed a model, and we've worked with the IRS, but we've gotten to a stopping point where you would be able to rank taxpayer services by the method in which it's delivered, so by the phones, face-to-face, online, and the different types of services like answering tax law questions, answering account questions, and those sorts of things, and looking at it from the government perspective, saying how much does this cost us to do, but then looking at it from the taxpayer perspective and in surveying taxpayers and saying, do you want this way? Do you want this service delivered this way? What are the barriers? And then matching them up and actually ranking services. And I think in that way you would actually be able to say, Taxpayers have told us, if we don't get service delivered in this particular way, we will make mistakes on our returns. And then you could start doing research to see whether that actually bears out. And that would tell you that this service needs to be funded for phone, whereas this service could be done online. And it would be a data-based, method of resource allocation, but it would take into consideration the government's concerns about, cost with the taxpayers' concerns about burden and accuracy and being able to comply with the laws.
So why do you think they don't have this rigorous methodology? You've got it, I think the council just shared with me, it's number 2 on your list.
Yes.
Why would they not have that?
I think some of it is because they're in a reactive mode. They look at the budget and they say, we've got to cut this much money. What things cost this much money? We'll cut them. That's why you don't have return preparation in the walk-in sites. That's why you got the 4 offshore offices cut. They're just looking around. It's not research-based. And I think that goes to the point about making some investments, but holding them accountable. That you've got to do some investments, and we want you to do this research. We know we might not see a return on investment this year, but it will guide your decisions going forward, and will get investments and efficiencies down the line.
All right. How can we best give you the tools to continue to apply pressure? Because we'll have this hearing, you'll make another report in June, I guess it will be, but we'll have these hearings, and what both of us find is that there's a flurry of activity that happens leading up to the hearing. And then the hearing happens and everybody goes, whew, it's over. And then there's a flurry of activity if we have you in a year from now. How can we make sure that the recommendations that you have get implemented, and that when you go to the agency and they say, well, we just, it's not a priority, or we don't, what we would love to do is look at it from a real budget standpoint and a real cost-effective standpoint and try to figure out where we need to be on that. How can we do that? Is it to get highlight reports from your office on a more regular basis?
Well, that is one thing. The commissioner, for the last 2 years, I've given the commissioner a memorandum with 10 or 12 recommendations from my annual report that are low or no cost. And the proposal that we did for the second problem is one of those low or no cost. Do this, just work with us on it. And I think it would be very helpful if this committee looked at some of our recommendations, thought this makes a lot of sense, and we think the IRS should move in this direction, and communicate that to the commissioner one way or another, and say, please come back and tell us what you are doing on these recommendations.
All right. Can you, for us, and I'll close with this, I'll give you the other questions that you can answer and submit back to the committee as your time permits. But I want to, can you prioritize for us, not only from the top 10, but the ones that you've got out there that have been out there that are an easy fix, that have been out there forever, and
Yes.
what I would say is an aging process. This has been a problem for 10 years or 20 years, or the fact that they're not even willing to do a beta test
Right.
on one of the easy
Right.
recommendations.
Right.
I do believe that the commissioner wants to improve service, and that may not be a popular thing to say, but I do believe that he wants to do that. I also believe that when we get so big at times, there is a difficulty at finding the right balance between, as you say, just cutting out. For
Right.
example, some of the additional Dodd-Frank regulations that came in, it exacerbated the problem overseas that Ms. Maloney was talking about. So we pass something on one side, it makes it more difficult in compliance, and as you and I have personally discussed, the form for the Affordable Care Act, it takes, I do know that it was probably designed by Jonathan Gruber, because it takes an MIT guy to figure it out. It's unbelievably complex. Would you agree?
Yes, it's right up there with the alternative minimum tax.
Well, if you would do that and highlight that for us, we're going to continue to come back to this and make it a priority. As the ranking member talked about from an IT standpoint, I think there are some things that we can help out with and continue to work. And I noticed that we have been joined by the delegate from the District of Columbia. So the chair, if she is ready to recognize Ms. Norton.
I want to thank my good friend, the chair, and the member from North Carolina. He always means well, believe me. I say to the taxpayer advocate. I've got some questions for you. I think all of my colleagues must have had the same issues I've had for the first time ever. I must say, it must be amazing to the IRS to see people willing to wait in line for the kinds of services. When I read about lines that the IRS had to come out and say, no more today, you'll have to come back. It's as if we're having something you were giving away. They're trying to give away their money. And I have to say to my good friends in the majority, there's a lot of chutzpah on Taxpayer's Day to call him the taxpayer advocate, because what we are told is that it's the taxpayer advocate that everybody is being sent to when they have problems. And it looks like the Congress is taking no responsibility for what has happened. No one's ever heard of a 17% cut in any agency, but my friends are not able to abolish the IRS, although there are 2 or 3 presidential nominee candidates running on abolishing the IRS. So they're trying to abolish it by starving it to death without recognizing that who gets starved are constituent services. Yeah, constituent services, something we live by. I was particularly outraged at what the Congress has done to the IRS, has made it difficult for the IRS to take advantage of one of the great innovations in the federal government, and that is the VITA services. VITA volunteers who must be certified, who come forward and for free fill out the tax preparation forms for people who are of modest income. And I mean, I think people $60,000 or so can still have that done. And we have VITA sites that we work with. Indeed, I have a whole day where I invite the sites and we all fill out the forms. The tax advocate, of course, comes. Then the VITA sites go and they spread throughout the District of Columbia. This is typical, I'm sure, of other members. And close to their neighborhood, they just help whoever comes in. Now, you require that these people, 100% volunteers, be certified, take a test. It's as if they were, civil servants. It is an amazing thing that the IRS has done for years. Now we're told that the VITA sites have been put in this extraordinary position that they now are being hammered because you can't expand the VITA sites, these volunteers, who have become expert in doing what you do. And yet, here's the Congress kind of calling the taxpayer advocate to task. It's amazing. A chutzpah or something else beyond that it takes to say, why aren't you doing a better job? I've asked to come up, though, particularly because of the VITA sites. Mm-hmm. I adore them. They have to be certified, whereas, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you are a company and you want to do taxes, does the IRS require any kind of certification for somebody who simply wants to set up a business and fill out your taxes and charge you for doing so?
So, first, I don't feel this committee is calling me to task. They're holding me accountable, and they've been very supportive.
Oh, you are so polite.
I'm not polite. They've been very supportive of the work that I've been doing.
By the way, for every reason, the taxpayer advocate is everybody's friend. The taxpayer advocate is who figures out the real problems our constituents have. But I can imagine offloading to you all the problems, saying, the IRS is not available, but the tax advocate is.
Right. Well, we are seeing a growth in our cases. I want to talk about the VITA program because we did make it a most serious problem this year in the annual report because of some of our concerns. The IRS staff supporting the program has been truncated, so I think the volunteers have not gotten the kind of support that they've needed in the last few years. And we've been concerned about how the IRS, the Congress has appropriated funds to make matching grants to some of the volunteer programs, but there have been a lot of restrictions on them. They're not being able to use them in some of the ways that the individual programs may think best, and we've
I
made
don't
some...
understand what you mean by that.
Well, for example, some of the programs want to be able to have a paid quality review person on their staff, which we should all agree would make sense. You've got volunteers doing the returns, maybe hire someone whose job it is to look at the quality of the returns.
As it is now, they still have to do quality review, but they also
They're not allowed, that has to be a volunteer too. And then one of the issues about taking that test, it's deeply ironic that we require the volunteers to take a test, but we don't have the authority to require unenrolled return preparers, people who just can hang up a shingle, aren't attorneys, aren't CPAs, aren't enrolled agents. And the IRS did try to do that through regulation, but the courts have overturned that, so now it's back in Congress's court to really give us the legal authority.
And of course, that would make more work for you if they made an error.
But it is, yes, exactly. That is one of the biggest ways that we could get more quality in the tax system. But I have recommended this year, and I think the IRS may do this, we're actually limiting the number of volunteers who are attorneys, CPAs, or enrolled agents who are willing to volunteer because every year they have to take this test. And these are people who are already, they've passed the bar exam, they've passed the CPA exam, they've passed the enrolled agent exam. So what I've recommended is have them take the test once in their lifetime, and then just take a short quiz every year about any changes in the law, but don't make them sit through it again, and you might get more volunteers.
The IRS would get to do that, Congress wouldn't have to do that.
I think they are, yeah, it's all IRS rules. You don't need legislation.
Well, as much as you can do to help yourself, the IRS, I think the IRS should simply do it. I think Congress, even Congress this year, I think will look at those cuts and understand that they have contributed to the crisis. It is a crisis. I wanted to come out and just apologize and to thank you for the work of the tax advocate, not only now when we're just dumping on you, nobody else is available to go see the tax advocate, but to thank you for what the tax advocate does all year, all the time, and how essential you have been to our constituents. Thank you very kindly.
Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
I think the gentleman, in the last question from the gentlelady from the district, you talked about growth in cases you're dealing with, and you attribute that to what exactly?
This year, we have a 5% growth so far, and we're seeing that from the filing season, people not being able to get through on the phones and coming to us.
So that's because they're not getting answers to the question.
That's right, or they're not getting their returns
Maybe I missed
processed.
this earlier. Is that a trend?
The 5% is a trend, yeah.
So it was 5% bigger than last year, and last year was 5% bigger than the previous year?
Let's see, the previous year it dropped from the year before, 2013 to 2014, it dropped a bit.
So it dropped, so it's not a trend?
It's not a trend, it's actually reversing the trend.
Okay, so the trend was coming down, and this
It was
went
coming
up.
down for about 2 years,
All right,
yes.
and it's, in your professional judgment, that's because of financial concerns.
It is the taxpayer service issues and would bring financial concerns.
Might it also, I'm just going to hazard a hypothesis, might it also be the complexity of the tax code? The tax code continues to get more and more complex. Maybe we need a new one. I would argue we do.
I have made the complexity of the code a number one most serious problem for several years.
And that's based on your professional judgment, and the people working your professional judgment that it's a financial cause, but also in your professional judgment, it could be because of the complexity.
Absolutely.
Ever-increasing complexity of the code.
Absolutely.
And you've not had an outside study done to say which is bigger, or have you?
That's hard, but I can give, just looking at my cases, for example, one year we had a huge bump in our cases solely attributable to the first-time homebuyer credit because it was a complex credit and we got 40,000 cases in 1 year.
I would think that's, the biggest concerns. You got a code that's, that big. Of course, there's going to be questions. That's why we need to reform the tax code. In your opening statement, or early on in the hearing, you mentioned critical pay authority. Can you define what that is exactly?
That is a special hiring authority where the IRS is able to bring people from the private sector and pay them above the general pay scale based on their skills, and it's a limited authority. They're able to come in for 4 years, but it's a way to bring the best and, the brightest from the private
And
sector.
what has happened to that authority?
It's called critical pay.
No, what has happened? Is it
It
expired?
has expired.
And you and Mr. Koskinen would like that to be back in place?
I think, yes, it
And
would be helpful.
so just to be clear, this is the authority to pay people at a higher level, higher wage, higher salary than what they're entitled to under the federal pay scale.
Yes, that's correct.
And where do these people typically work?
They would work often in our IT function. That's what it was really originally intended for, was the information
Yeah.
technology.
And you know the difficulty we have as policymakers with that, right?
Would you explain that to me?
Well, I mean, the same, so you had critical pay authority for all this time, and we had this whole escapade with, and these are in the IT people, the tech people, of losing Lois Lerner's emails, finding out you had lost them, not the IRS not telling, not you, but Mr. Koskinen waiting 2 months to tell us that they had lost them. Then once they inform us that they lost them, the Inspector General, 2 weeks after, we're informed that they're lost, and that Mr. Koskinen has assured us that they cannot be recovered, that the backup tapes have been destroyed. 2 weeks after that, the Inspector General drives to Martinsburg, West Virginia, and gets the backup tapes, and lo and behold, we found them. And so all these IT people that you need critical pay authority to pay didn't do a very good job in that situation, which has been the most high-profile situation at the Internal Revenue Service over the last 2 years. And now you're asking, and Mr. Koskinen is asking to pay these people more than anyone else in the federal pay scale makes, and give you this critical pay authority. I think that's going to be really difficult.
I can only say that it is my belief that it would benefit the IRS to be able to bring people from the private sector in to help us learn more about innovation and those sorts of things. And to get those people in, it's very hard to match the salaries that they're able to make on the outside. And that's the purpose of critical pay.
Yep. Well, I mean, respectfully, I have a slightly different opinion. I thank the chairman for his indulgence.
The chair recognizes the ranking member.
Thank
for your
you,
comments.
Mr. Chairman. Well, let's try the other side of this. So maybe the way to get the IRS technologically advanced and solving the kinds of problems Mr. Jordan just described is actually let's pay everyone in the technology and IT sector half of what they might make otherwise. Would that work?
I don't know. I mean, that's a proposal, yes.
So do we have a brain drain going on in the IRS?
I think that right now, it is very difficult to bring people in from outside. Some people view it as a challenge. I certainly do. I think Commissioner Koskinen does.
Would it be fair to say that whatever that brain drain is, or the difficulty, put differently, the difficulty to recruit, is particularly acute in the higher skill end?
Yes, I would say that.
So maybe having some pay differential or some kind of incentive pay structure might be useful if we're going to compete with the private sector or even have a fighting chance to do that.
I agree with that, and I don't think it has to be matching private sector salaries because people come to work for the government out of a public service motivation, but it's hard to take such a huge hit in your private sector salary.
Switching subjects, what percentage of American taxpayers are voluntarily compliant in paying their taxes?
It's 83% or so before we count later on collections, and it's a little under 86% if you count late payments and enforcement collections.
If you had a subset of those Americans where that number, that percentage was 97%, how would you characterize that?
It would be extraordinarily compliant.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and Ms. Olson, I would like to thank you, for your time today, taking the time to appear for your direct answers. It's very welcoming, coming from some committees where perhaps the answers are not as direct or complete. So thank you so much. I would also like to thank the staff of the committee here. Much of the work that gets done is always their hard work and that we carry out. And I'd like to thank your staff, so many of them who are here today. Thank you for your work. Truly appreciate it. And if there is no further business without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.